Hello and welcome to the Cosmic Shambles Sunday Science Q&A session. We are without Robin today. He's been called away to deal with some other stuff. So we have me and our very special guest from the other side of the world. Never say we don't bring you worldwide expertise. We have Dr. Karl all the way from Australia. Whereabouts in Australia are you, Karl?
Like most people, I come from Sydney, but I've just been up at Seal Rocks, which is the second most easterly part of Australia. And I went flippering this morning, or snorkeling, and I saw a manta ray, a stingray, 2 meters across, and a turtle in the water. And then also saw, while I was walking on the beach, maybe 5 dolphins at a time, vertical in the front of the wave coming down, which is just amazing. And of course, up at Seal Rocks, maybe 24 whales as well.
Well, I think you can stop telling us that now because, like most people in Britain, I haven't seen any marine life for quite a long time because we're not allowed out very much. So, you know, just keep your stories of the beautiful Pacific Ocean. Keep a lid on them, I reckon. A little bit's all right, but don't make us too jealous. Okay, so there's always admin. There's always admin before we get started. So let's deal with some of the admin. There is, of course, a tip jar just below this, somewhere down at the bottom of the screen down there. So if you would like to contribute, we are supporting arts venues, all the sorts of places that are the cultural and artistic venues that are really having a difficult time through all of this. So we're still supporting them when we can. Please contribute to the tip jar if you can. Of course, you don't have to. It's free. We try to make it free for everyone. There is also Patreon if you would like to support, especially some of our bigger projects. You can subscribe to our Patreon account. You get extra long episodes of Robin and others rambling on about things if you do that. And other stuff as well. So there's lots of stuff for Patreon. There's all these links on the screen just below where you're looking. Some other plugs. There is now a genetics shambles on Wednesday night, and the next one is at 8:30 next Wednesday. It's the new series that's being made in collaboration with the Genetics Society and the Milner Centre for Evolution at the University of Bath. So lots of genetics is on offer there. Wednesday night is going to be a bit of a gallop through the history of research into the human genome, and Robin will be hosting, and there'll also be Adam Rutherford, Professor Joel McVean, Sarah Teichmann, and lots and lots of genetic science. So tune in on Wednesday evening for that. The final episode of our ESA series, Science in Zero G, is out now. So back in November, I think it was, Ginny Smith and I went to ESA in France. I got to fly on the parabolic flight, well, fall on it, I guess. And Ginny was helping out, talking to all the experimenters, especially on the psychological side of all of that. We covered loads of experiments. So that entire series is now online for you to watch. So do have a look at that. And there will be a bonus 7th episode for Patreon subscribers, just to keep keep a bit of suspense in there. What might you have if you were a Patreon supporter? Well, a 7th bonus ESA episode. And on Tuesday night, because someone has really got going with the naming puns thing here, at 7:30 p.m, and I have to read this carefully to get it right, there will be Teenage Student Neuro Hurdles. And I'm sure that whoever came up with that was very proud of it. Anyway, so this is a discussion about teenage mental health. It was meant to be live at Latitude next week, but of course that's not happening. So it is going to be online on Tuesday night, and lots of Cosmic Shambles regulars will be there. Dean Burnett, Susie Gage, Pete Etchells, and Susie Kundu will be chairing. So definitely, if you're interested in teenage mental health, and all of us have either been there or will have been there, go. That's 7:30 on Tuesday. And if you have any live questions as we're going along, we've got lots of questions on our list, but we never mind having some more added in. So if you've got any questions, send them in via Twitter or email, and we will do our best to answer them. So we're going to get going. Now, both Karl and I have a show and tell. Now mine is random things I have on my shelf. So this is an egg timer, although I have to confess I've never used it to time eggs. That's a bit of a rubbish background. What can I put? I'm going to find a piece of paper so you can see a little bit better. Anyway, it's an egg timer. I'm doing some. Let's just be organised with this. There we go. Right, so now you can see. So it's an egg timer. It does what egg timers do. Now, the fun bit about this is that it doesn't just do what egg timers do. So over here, I've got a magnet. And if I put it underneath the egg timer, perhaps you can see that all the sand is not actually sand, it's magnetic material. So if I take it away, the sand all falls down, but every single little particle in here can pick up the magnetic field. You can actually, I can move it around a bit. It's not good. The nice thing is that as it piles up, it makes these little spiky things. And that's because every new little particle that falls down turns into a little bar magnet with a north end and a south end. And they stack up in order, basically, and try and get as far away from each other as possible. So you get these beautiful little pointy bits. I love the way it just goes away. I'm going to keep playing with this a little bit more. So there's the thing. Here's the magnet, little towers of magnetism. And the thing I love about this is that, so it's just a magnetic sand egg timer. The thing I love about it is that it really highlights that the fun science is often hidden. So you could look at that egg timer, you could keep it running for years and years and years if you wanted to time eggs for a long time, and you would never know that it had all that potential if you just brought a magnet near it. And all you have to do is bring the magnet and you get a huge amount of extra fun. So that is one of the random things on my shelf for today. Karl, what is the random thing that you have brought to show us?
This is a piece of pumice, floating rock, about the size of my head. And about 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, a volcano exploded underwater off the coast of Australia, a couple of thousand kilometres out to sea. And the entire east coast of Australia had this pumice, this floating volcanic rock with bubbles in it, hence it float, come on shore. It was originally sighted by some pilots who saw a flat raft of this pumice covering an area the size of Belgium. That's what they said. I don't know how big that is. Then I went down the beach and it was just coming up for week after week. And so this is just one of the many pieces I brought back. And it is literally a rock that floats. So that's my show and tell.
And is that the sort of thing that happens regularly in that area, or did it come as a bit of a surprise to everyone? Stuff with suddenly arriving.
It was a bit of a surprise. There's been some more pumice come up recently, but we don't know where the volcano was that caused that. We haven't been able to deconvolute the mathematics backwards to work out where it came from. So, well, it is. There you go. If you didn't believe that rock can float, pick the right rock, and it can float. And also, like, pumice is the stuff that people use for, or it used to be used for, smoothing people's skin, polishing people's skin, I guess, because it was a little bit rough, but not actually going to, rip you apart. So it floats, and you can use it for buffing yourself up, should you wish. Okay, so let's get on to the questions for today. We have lots of questions from lots of people, and we'd love to hear who you are. So if you send us a question, do send us your name and your age, perhaps, if you would like to. So we are going to start with a question from Matt Smythe. So Karl, I'm sure you've got ideas on this. I've certainly got a few. He says, there's a lot of talk about establishing a moon base. Why would you bother? He says he's not against the idea. He might get a vote, I don't know. He's just curious about the major benefit of having a moon base, given that we already have an international space station. So, Karl, what do you think about this? Do you think it's worth? For the long-term survival of humanity, yes. About 4 years ago, a big rock missed the Earth, and of course it missed the Earth. But if it had hit, it was 600 metres across. It would have wiped out somewhere between 10 and 70% of the human race, depending on whether it landed in the dead heart of Australia or in the middle of the Pacific Ocean or on one of the 200 or so supervolcano sites around the world. Okay, 600 metres. If we had had 3 years warning that it was going to have a direct impact with Earth, the human race would have got together and worked out some way to divert it. We had only 3 weeks warning of this 600-metre rock. We have to become a space-going race. We have to get good engines, like the chemical rockets are just hopeless, 15, 20 kilometres a second. I want fusion, and I want 1% of the speed of light, 3,000 kilometres a second. And so going to the moon is part of that, of becoming a space-going race.
So do you think, because I always think about that, so first of all, I don't know if you're suggesting that we might go to the moon to because anything that hits the Earth is going to affect the moon, I think. But also, are we not better off looking after our our own planet before worrying about running away to other places? Do you really think we're going to get to other planets? Because they're a long way away and they're quite inhospitable.
We do need different types of technology, and looking after Earth, we do a lot of that by having a small amount of research. The amount of money spent on space is microscopic. It went from 2% of the American budget to get us to the moon down to 0.2% to 0.02%. If you want to look at big budgets, have a look at the military budget. So I think it's part of the overall package that will lead us to a better future.
So I would also add for Matt, actually, that whether or not humans go further into space, we probably want things in space that are either looking back at Earth or they're doing jobs for us, keeping an eye on the sun. And if you launch something from the moon, it's you don't need as big a rocket. So if you can build bigger things on the moon and launch them from there effectively, which gives you, so you can take your things there in bits, because it's hard to get stuff off the surface of Earth. Maybe you could mine things on the moon, but then you've got basically a staging post that would let you go on, I think. It's expensive. I mean, Karl's talking about money, but go on.
Yes, it is expensive, but I'm trying to take the big view. You've probably heard of Kardashev, the Russian astronomer who divided civilizations by the amount of power they generated and used into, conveniently, 1, 2 and 3, level 1, 2 and 3, and we're not even level 1. And the way to work it out is to remember the numbers 16, 26 and 36. So in about 200 years, we'll get to the stage of generating and using 10 to the 16 watts. That's 1 followed by 16 zeros, which is, interestingly enough, the amount of power put out by the sun falling on us in a thin pencil beam that comes from space and lands on the Earth. That'll be 200 years. Going at our current rate of power energy production, we'll get to a type 2 civilization where we use the energy, the power put out by the sun in all directions. That's 10 to the 26 watts in 2,500 years. That's a bit before the time of Christ. And another 2,500 years after that, we'll go to 10 to the 36 watts, which is being able to generate and use the power of an entire galaxy. So the thing is, we don't want to get ourselves wiped out either by stupid things like viruses, by not doing proper social distancing, or by getting wiped out by meteors, or even stupider, global warming. We've got to look after ourselves, and space exploration is a part of that.
So if you can tap into the power of a galaxy, then what are you going to do with it? So if that's a lot of energy, and you've got to collect it, obviously there's all the problems with that. But say you did have the plug socket to the galaxy's power supply, what could you do with that energy?
Well, and get yourself across to the next galaxy. And the trouble is that we've got these rather inconvenient bodies. I mean, the point about evolution is that it just has to be good enough. But the meat bags that we've designated with it, we've been allotted, they're okay. Like the hip joint I like. The hip joint is a ball and socket joint, and I'm good on the hip joint. The knee joint sucks. It looks like you've got two soup bowls on top of each other, sliding on top of each other, one on the left, one on the right, and they're held together by gaffer tape on the left and the right and the front and the back, and a bit of gaffer tape going down the middle. You might have heard of the ACL, the Anterior Cruciate Ligament. So I see us evolving from our shapes into a superior shape, and Freeman Dyson, in his book Disturb the Universe, discusses that the proper shape for a human being is, and I quote, a cloud of iron vapour weighing 50 kilograms, the diameter of a planet, floating through space on magnetic fields. And you're thinking, but really the most important thing is how you can have sex. Well, Frank Zappa answered that, and the answer is that your brain is your main sexual organ. The other bits on the outside, they just provide input to the brain.
I have to say it is very physicist-like. I mean, Freeman Dyson did many things, but it is very physicist-like to assume that the ideal shape for a human is a sphere. I mean, really, you couldn't make that up. I'm not entirely sure I agree with him, and I do quite like my knees, but I can definitely see that we are getting pretty good at replacing bits that go wrong. So, maybe we just have to. I quite like the imperfection, actually. I don't want to be perfectly optimized. I like you're not in for that. You want to be bionic everything.
No, I want to have a better shape. So you might have heard of, firstly, the anterior cruciate ligament. Have you heard about that? A terrible design. Secondly, with the knees, what you've got is two little things,
You really
a
don't like
ball.
knees, do you? You've got a real problem with the design of the knee.
Oh, the eye's pretty bad as well. So you've got a little ball that floats and another little ball floating in a socket, and that's one knee. And joining the two of them is a washer. Now, you would think that the washer would be a complete circle. We call this a meniscus. No, it is not a complete circle. It's not like the letter O. It's like the letter C. Who thought of that? And it's posteriorly deficient.
It works. We've got Usain Bolt who can run the 100 metres in, ridiculously short periods of time, and his knees seem to work perfectly fine.
For a while, but a lot of people have problem with their knees because of that. Close enough is good enough. So with evolution, all you have to do is have babies and then you're on your own. So maybe at 24 years and 365 days of age, you can go out for the weekend, consume your own weight in party drugs, rage away for 4 weeks, come back on the Monday. Okay, you do a bit of time dilation, and people say, "Oh, how are you going, Helen? It was great." But at 25 years and one age, if you stay up late to watch something on the BBC, they'll say, "Oh my God, you look like crap. What did you do?" "I stayed up past 9 o'clock. "Oh my God, darling." So evolution is good enough, but we can do better.
This is an ongoing discussion. I'm sure everyone on Twitter has lots of opinions about this. And sleep, obviously, is another part of this, because we know that sleep is good for our brains. And there's a question about whether you could have intelligence without sleep. But obviously, lots of my friends quite like sleep. I quite like sleep. But people feel it wastes time. I don't think it wastes time. Anyway, so if you've got questions or comments about the nature of human beings and whether we should be aiming for some kind of spherical physical perfection, or whether you quite like your knees as they are, please do let us know. I can see that being a long Twitter conversation. And then there's all the other animals that have different knees of different types. Anyway, so let us move on to a question from Sally, and she says, is there a type of renewable energy that is really being overlooked at the moment? And then in brackets she adds, apart from all of it. So
tidal energy is a big one. So yeah, with regard to Australia, between the top of Australia and the two countries above it, New Guinea, Indonesia, appears 10% of all the tidal energy in the whole world, and the amount of it that we capture is zero. The trouble with getting energy out of the ocean is that the ocean is a hostile environment. So that's one, of course. But with regard to Australia, we can provide, and there's 17 major renewables, we can provide all of our energy just from two renewables: solar thermal to provide 60% of our energy, and wind to provide the remaining 40%. It depends on where you are. So one of the Canary Islands became the first country in the world, or location, to become totally renewable, and they have a convenient extinct volcano, which not everybody has. And so the wind blows and it generates electricity, which firstly provides electricity to the townships, but secondly, pumps water into the nearby convenient volcano. And when the wind goes down, it comes down again. So you use whatever is local.
So the solution, it is a fair point that the solution to a lot of renewable energy problems is to live somewhere where there is renewable energy. I mean, it is an arrogant thing that humans do, I think, where they just think they can live everywhere. And actually, if you met this planet cold, as it were, and you said, where do we want to live, you would pick probably these places with a volcano or with some large tidal energy. I think Orkney is also 100% powered by tidal and wind energy, but tides obviously vary at different heights in different places. So I think, Sally, that there aren't any obvious ones that are being overlooked. It's more a case of what fits in your own location. I think one of the real dangers with this debate is that there's a silver bullet solution. Like, here, anyone who comes to you and says, this is going to solve your problems, with the single exception of fusion if they sort it out, everything else is just complicated. It depends on where you live. So don't listen to anyone that says, I can give you the solution, because they're almost always wrong.
So as an example, with regard to just solar photovoltaic, to supply all of Australia with its electrical energy, we need an area in our deserts 50 kilometres in diameter. But to supply the whole world, we need a circle 500 kilometres in diameter. So we can scatter the energy generation planets around the world and then just pipe the electricity through wires and, of course, bring on room temperature superconductivity as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Well, that's a message to the physicists, isn't it? Get busy on all of that. And plants, plants do a good job. Anyway, okay, so I hope there are. So I think the answer is not many that are being overlooked, just not enough effort going into the ones that already exist. Although there is, it is something the UK actually is starting to do all right at. Could do better, but starting to do all right. Okay, next question from Nick. How do bumblebees fly? Do you want to go first, Karl? It's complicated. This one is brilliantly complicated.
Yeah, it involves over to you, Dr. Helen.
So the interesting thing about bumblebees is they do it just by moving their wings extremely quickly. So there's some types of flights which is basically gliding, and animals can lift themselves up a bit and then glide a bit, and they've got large wing surface areas, and that's how it works. You get a bit of forward propulsion, and then you've got an aerofoil that keeps you going forward for long enough to get somewhere with it. Bumblebees do it the hard way around. And if you look at the beat, so bumblebees, if you ever see one, they've got super fragile wings. But when you look, they have this beat pattern which twists. I think they have 4 wings, but they are pushing against the air. And the reason it works is that the smaller you are, the more important the viscosity of the air is. So for a bumblebee, at the speed it's moving, the air is a lot more like syrup rather than it is, just sort of, I don't know, the nebulous stuff that we walk through. So basically, a bumblebee is stamping on the air with this very clever, complicated, fast wing beat pattern that is pushing on this really viscous air. And it works because the bumblebee is small enough to do it, and it's happening so quickly that the air has trouble getting out of the way fast enough. And so the reason they make the buzzing noise is that they're basically stamping on the air, they're thumping into it. And it's astonishing that it works. It's so energy intensive. It's not an elegant way to fly, but it does work. Yeah.
And sometimes you see bees walking on the ground, and that's because they've run out of energy. So if you give them a little glucose drink, that'll charge up their batteries and they'll be able to fly back again. And the myth about them being unable to fly dates back to some time, and I forget the date. I read about this in one of my books, probably number 5 backwards or so, where they the aerodynamicists tried to apply simple aerodynamics of the time and didn't take account of their complicated movement that you mentioned and the turbulence at the leading and trailing edges of the wings. But in a way, they're exactly as you described. They're a little bit like a helicopter. They don't actually fly. They kind of beat the air into submission.
Which is the way to go. And apparently on the topic of beating nature into submission, Twitter has agreed that knees are rubbish. I still disagree with all of you. I like my knees. So
well, what about the retina? So in the retina, we have the retina, firstly, is one of the most oxygen-hungry parts of the body, along with the heart.
It's very small. That's all right. It's only little.
So it's got big fat blood vessels. Now, here's a question for you. Would you have the blood vessels between the retina and the outside light or behind it? And in the case of the squid, they're behind. In the case of humans, they're in front. Who thought of that? Probably the person who came up with the knees.
Well, it means you can see them, right? You can check they're there. When they do that weird thing in opticians, you can actually see your own blood vessels in your eye. It's quite nice to know they're there, I think.
Yeah, and you have to use a weird sort of computer programming to make them go invisible. And if you do the thing of lying on the ground with your eyes shut and just stare at the sky, if you can defocus enough, you can see little things going, and they're the red blood cells in the blood vessels in front of your eye going across. This is one of the many Purkinje effects, Purkinje. I think he was a Hungarian physiologist and physicist. And
anything with that many consonants has to be Hungarian, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a difference here, because I quite like seeing how things work, and I don't mind things being imperfect as long as they're interesting. So you can go and be your spherical ball of ions without a retina in space, and I think I'm going to stay here on Earth and be imperfect enjoy the imperfection.
But see, I spent 10 years in medical land, being a medical doctor, and when you see a human suffering with an imperfection, at that stage you think, I want a better design or evolutionary outcome.
Fair point. Although, yes, well, this is a debate that's going on. I think fixing that's a good idea. Let's move on from the knees. And the retina and all these other biological flaws. We have a question from Sydney, who has a very good memory. This is very specifically for you, Karl. He says, I don't know why I remember this, but 10 years ago, perhaps, on Triple J, Dr. Karl was stumped for a long time about what the most effective way to hang a towel on a washing line was for the quickest drying on a rainy day, whether it was horizontal or vertical. And I remember him talking to a number of physicists over weeks and never coming to an answer. And he would like to know if you ever found out the answer.
We had people doing these experiments. So the question is, it's a rainy day or you've only got a little bit of sunlight left. You want to hang your washing on the line. It's come through late in the day. And the question is, do you hang the towel left, right in the so-called landscape mode? Or do you hang it vertically in the portrait mode? And if you think about it, you can come up with reasons why each one has its own advantages. And we had some people doing it in a garage, and I forget what they came up with. And so the answer is, I've forgotten. I don't know. And I'm going to have to chase that up. And I think I'll need to put that in my next book. Thank you very much, Dr. Sydney, for refreshing my memory on that.
Well, I think we can experiment here. Anyone, next time it rains really hard, anyone who's got two identical-ish towels, hang one way, one the other, weigh them before and afterwards, and see which one is heavier. I reckon we can all do that experiment. All right, let us move. I don't know anything about towels drying, so not on washing lines in that way. So let's have a question from Tim Hollander. He says, is there any difference between the way a barcode and a QR code work, or are they just different ways of storing information? So I would say they're different ways of storing information, but they're quite interesting. Go on, Karl.
The guy who came up with the barcode died about 4 or 5 years ago, so I did a story on that, which you can get by going ABC on Google, ABC, Dr. Karl and barcode. And they came up with a few designs, and the original one was a circular one, but they end up coming up with the one that they came up with, the whole bunch of lines like this, because it didn't matter whether you went through in that direction, or if the printing was bad. So they're quite different, but they store information. Now, speaking about information, it seems to be the currency. And I just found out by reading a book called The Internet. I know it's a fairly one, by somebody called Ball.
Is that a book now? I thought it was just something you could switch off if you pressed the wrong button on it. But the book's actually called The Internet. And
to my surprise, every single time we're talking about information and data, so the barcode and the QR code, they store information differently. Every single time you, personally, Dr. Helen, go onto a different web page or refresh the one you're on, all of your details are auctioned off. And something between 100 and 1,000 people, organisations, advertising agencies, will bid on the right to put advertisements on the page that you're going to.
So some of that's, you can switch some of that off, right? You have some privacy controls. You can opt out of some. I think if you're not aware of it, it does tend to worry people. Although some people don't mind if they think they're getting. There's that thing about, what's that phrase about? If you don't know where the price tag is, you're the thing. If you don't know what's being sold, it's you. Something like that.
Yeah. So Facebook is free, and typically in a quarter they make $31.9 billion of income, and of that, 31.6 is from advertising. And it's similar for Google and the like. The profits are huge. We're all sort of little bits of grist in the giant advertising machine. So your data is being auctioned off every time you go onto a new web page.
Well, that came as news a few years ago, wasn't it? When he was asked how Facebook made money. Famous line, Senator, we sell ads. And the American politicians were not as up to date. They had not been listening to Dr. Karl. Okay, so let's move on to... Oh, here's a good one. Mm-hmm. From Lorna Duggan. what is the optimum sized pot to grow a sunflower so that the stalk isn't just tall, but is thick enough to provide support for the flower? So I have never tried growing sunflowers in different sizes of pot. I imagine that, because I guess the thing about, so roots serve many functions, but one of them is a structural function, and they are the foundation for the plant. Sunflowers are I've always thought sunflowers are extraordinary structures because they are so top heavy. Like that, even if it's quite a thick stem, it's still, if you compare it to our skyscrapers, it's a very narrow thing with this enormous, great big lump at the top. They are astonishing. What do you know about sunflowers? Do you grow them?
No, but the answer would belong somebody like our line of work, a physicist, but a biophysicist would know. And I imagine that the roots would have to go down maybe 1/3 or 1/5 of the height of the plant. But then you have other plants that put down roots incredibly long distances. And we're now able to do mining, geological mining or prospecting by looking at what's in the leaves of certain plants. And we found in Australia that certain plants gather gold by putting down roots very deeply, up to 50 or 80 meters deep, which is astonishing. But what do you reckon, Helen? Would you say like maybe 10, 20% of the plant down for a broad ball of root structure? Was it enough for observation?
I think it's really interesting because they're very different. I know more about the root structures of trees, where you can get trees where they live on rock. So you've only got a narrow, shallow bit of topsoil, and then you have to have a lot of roots, but they're very wide. So it's like a sort of signpost with great big wide feet, but they don't go down very far. And then you get some that have a deep tap that goes straight down, and you have this structure that goes all the way down and hold things in. And it's interesting because trees and plants are different, because trees have wood, and plants don't. I mean, trees are plants, but the sort of flowering plants that you see don't have this woody structure, which acts as the core, the structural core of a tree. So most of a tree, when you look at it, is just the stuff on the inside. The living stuff's all on the outside. The inside is just the leftover structure. It's a bit like coral. You leave the inner bits behind and grow more on top. And so trees have that extra bit of this leftover. They're basically growing on the surface of themselves, their past selves. That's what a tree is. So
you raised a really good point there, that in fact with the sunflowers, they could go horizontally, thus giving them structural integrity against falling over. Where is a plant biologist when we need one? Come on down, plant biologist.
Well, I think this is the kind of science that has only really been got to recently, because of course once you pull it, until very recently you had to basically pull a plant out to see what its roots look like, and so you were always disturbing things. And I think it's probably only recently that you can actually get down, you can scan well enough to put the entire thing inside a CT scanner and see what shape the roots are.
Sure.
I have a colleague who laser scans trees, because apparently the estimates of one of the ways of estimating the amount of biomass on Earth is to look at sort of look down from a satellite and say, oh, well, there's some green stuff here. We know that's trees. We think this is how much biomass that translates into. And what he's been doing is going around actually laser scanning the entire structure of a tree, so that while it's still alive, you can tell how much biomass is actually there. And apparently the standard estimates most people work with have been quite wrong. And it really depends on the type of tree, and it's a very subtle problem. So I think there's a lot of areas of science where this, if you can, now that we can properly 3D scan things, especially without disturbing them, you stand a much better chance of working out what's actually going on. You'd think it was quite easy to know how big a tree was or the mass of a tree. It's a really hard question. Okay. It's because all this comes on the internet. There was going to be a cat question. Why do cats hate getting wet? I don't know, actually. Do you know anything about why cats hate getting wet?
Don't know why. I do know that most cats don't like it, but then most people don't like getting wet. Are they specifically hydrophobic? Don't know. We need a small animal vet to give us the answer on that. Maybe one can come in with an answer. And how should they give their answers if they're listening?
So Twitter, we're always on Twitter, and also the Cosmic Shambles email is open. I love the idea of a hydrophobic cat, though. I can totally see a cat just walking into a puddle and the water kind of just moving away from it. But also, it's a valid question because dogs, without any hesitation, will just launch themselves splat and happily dive in lakes and ponds in the ocean. I've got friends whose dogs go surfing with them, you know, all that kind of thing. And cats don't. I reckon cats are probably sensing their environment, are a lot more subtle about sensing their environment. And I reckon being wet probably stops them knowing what's going on quite so much. I wonder what happens when a cat's whiskers, you know, they're part of the way a cat senses where it can fit. So maybe they don't like wet whiskers. Yeah. So I don't know. Go on.
Because what you're saying actually makes a huge amount of sense. And I suddenly realised remembered the old experiment, don't do this at home, where you tie loosely, don't do this at home, a tea towel around the belly of a cat and it falls over. Because they use their fur for working out what their position is in total dark. And if you're providing them with stimulus from the left of their belly, the right of their belly, the top and the bottom, they're getting overstimulated and they don't know what is real. And don't do this at home. But the cat then just falls over. So I like your answer that they use their fur for their proprioception of knowing where their limbs are, but also where they are with regard to the world. And being wet just interferes with it. So what the heck? Yeah, great answer, Dr. Helen.
Well, I don't know. The cats may have an opinion on this. The people who own, because people put coats on dogs, don't they? But not on cats. Maybe no one can catch the cats.
And maybe if you do, the cat will just fall to the ground, virtually paralysed, unable to do anything because it's got too many inputs.
Someone is so going to have their cat with a coat on it. Just don't. As long as no cats should be harmed in the doing of this experiment, right? Physics has a bad enough rap already when it comes to cats. We don't need any more distressed cats. Okay, right. So next one from Jessie Bryce, from somewhere that isn't the UK, apparently. When moving to the UK, I couldn't believe you were allowed sockets or switches. You weren't allowed sockets or switches in the bathroom, and yet a 7 kilowatt power shower is fine in the shower. So are other countries really in danger with their bathroom sockets? So yes, in the UK, there are only 2 power supplies you can have to your bathroom. You can have like a shaver plug, which is only shavers and toothbrushes and things plug into, or you can have a power shower. What are the rules in Australia, Karl? Can you electrocute yourself in the shower if you want?
I've got 4 regular GPOs or general power outlets in my bathroom, and we have no specific regulations. I can see that if you were the country that was one of the first to wire itself up with electricity, you'd be worried about condensation from the shower, from the moist air, going into the socket and then perhaps causing corrosion. It wouldn't short things out because the water would not be carrying salt, but you would be worried about long-term reliability problems, and you don't want that sort of problem. But as it turns out, by using copper and the like, we end up not having those problems. So maybe this is a hangover from the past. I don't know what the situation is in the USA, but I do know that in Australia it's perfectly allowed.
I think you do get plug sockets in bathrooms in the US, normal plug sockets. And my grandfather was an electrical engineer, mechanical engineer, who went very early on when TVs were first a big thing. He became a TV engineer, and I think I've heard my nana say that that if you plug things in wrong, first of all they went bang. You knew about it. There was less health and safety, but also I've heard my mum say that it was quite common if you had 2 things to plug in and you only had 1 plug socket, that you would take the plug. Definitely do not do this. This episode is full of things that really don't do at home. They would take the plug off the second thing, so you strip it down to bare wires, put those wires in the hole and jam the other plug on top so that it would power both things. I know. Apparently this was normal. But actually, so that takes us on very nicely, and you will see why, Karl, to a question from Simon Jenkins, which is in reference to the last episode of the Ince series, which is still available. All of it is still available, all 6 or 7 parts of it, depending on whether you're a patron supporter or not. It was about things cooling down in space, and he wonders why the Apollo 13 spacecraft cockpit became so cold. he had thought that with the sun shining in and the system shut down, it would have heated up. And this is not unrelated to condensation. So let's start with the temperature thing. How if you just have a spacecraft in space and you don't do anything to it, does it heat up or does it cool down?
One side will be very hot, up to 150 degrees C, and the other one will be maybe minus 100 degrees C, so they have to go through a rotation. So I'll hand over to you because you're a real physicist and I'm not, but basically you've got a balance between how much heat you're generating and maybe black body comes into it, how much heat you're radiating out. Now, I do not know whether they have specific heating coils or facilities in spacecraft so that they keep warm. I do know that with the astronauts, they have to cool them down, and they have something like 90 meters of hose inside their spacesuit circulating around to keep one side over the other. Dr. Helen?
Well, so when we cover this on the ESA thing, obviously the major, so you're right that all modern spacecraft and the Apollo ones too were covered in reflective material to try and stop the sun cooking them, basically. So you don't have a huge amount of heat from the sun. But the other thing you don't have out in space, if you're doing what Apollo was doing, is you don't have gravity, and that means you don't have convection. And so cooling things down is really hard, as you said, Karl. If you're a human and you if I don't know, do loads of weight lifting things with this arm and this shoulder warms up, sure, my blood vessels bring heat to the surface and some of it's radiated away, but also the air that is flowing past, any air that takes a little bit of that heat warms up, and then its buoyancy changes and it moves away and another packet comes in. And so buoyancy only works because of gravity. So without gravity, you don't have any buoyancy. So you don't have this automatic, like nature's cooling system is convection. So I think in the case of the cockpit, I think I'm not an expert on Apollo. This is a question for Kev Fong or Dallas Campbell. But I do think that any electronics they were running would have needed a power input to cool them down. And that was a balance between the power needed to run your power in thing, not wanting to use too much power, and also if you switch that off, then your electronics will overheat, and you've got to move that heat then somewhere else. So I'm not sure, but I think I remember reading that there wasn't very much heating because the electronics were just naturally heating anything. Like you say, the temperature something is a balance between what goes in and what comes out. But then if you switch off, they were running out of power. If you start switching off the electronics, you also lose some of your heating. So that is probably a question that someone on Google has written a beautiful answer to, and it wasn't me. But go on, Karl.
No, I was just thinking there's a wonderful book called Apollo 8, which deals with the history of it. But I think you've hit it on the head there, Dr. Helen, where they were limited enormously in what electronics they could use, and electronics have got all sorts of waste heat. And I do remember from the movie that they were shivering, and I think it was a pretty close to reality movie. So I like your explanation, Dr. Helen. I think you're right.
Well, I think the reason related to the previous question is I think they were also worried about condensation. That one of the concerns was that if they changed the temperature too quickly, because they were breathing out water vapor, moisture would condense on the electronics. And that was a bigger problem than anything else. Like they could be cold for a bit in order not to have condensation. So I can't quite remember how the balance worked because I think there was a separate little module, but condensation was definitely part of that story.
And just to finish off, if you buy a set of those nice, accurate digital scales and weigh yourself last thing at night and first thing in the morning and do not go and have a bathroom break overnight, you lose somewhere between about 300 and 600 grams of both water vapor and carbon dioxide overnight. So you do actually lose weight overnight. And so the water vapor that you're talking about is a significant amount, half a kilo.
And especially, I guess, it's quite warm here in the UK at the moment. And if it's warm at night, you're probably sweating a bit more. That would be really interesting. That would be a great thing to do, wouldn't it? To compare the weight difference at the beginning, before and after sleeping with the ambient temperature in your room. Someone could do a really nice, if anyone's really bored for the next year, you can measure that difference, keep a record of the temperature in your room and possibly the humidity, and see what you learn about your own thermoregulation.
But then you'd have to account for alcohol consumption, because beer has a diuretic effect, which can be summed up in 6 words with a comma: drink a 6-pack, urinate a 10-pack. So for each 200 mils of beer that you drink, you'll generate 320 mils of urine. Now you can see that I haven't quite done it correctly, because really it should say drink a 6-pack, urinate a 9.6-pack. So I gave up scientific accuracy for the point of poetic scanning. I apologise.
I'm sure the beer drinkers of the world will forgive you. And I don't know, if people are getting out in the sunshine here and drinking more beer, there's something for you to think about along the way. Right, so from R, so this person hasn't got a first name, they just have an initial, which is, well, maybe it is their first name, I don't know. R. Herod, with rising oceans, what are the pros and cons of using mass desalination stations around the world to make use of all that extra water? Do all desalination plants desalinate water in the same way? So.
Whoa. Okay, the ocean level is rising at around 9 microns or micrometers, a millionth of a meter per day. And if you took all of the 2 billion tons of shipping out of the oceans, that would drop the oceans by 6 microns. And so after 18 hours, the ocean would be back to its previous height. My understanding is with desalination, with regard to water and what's called the hydrosphere, look it up on Wikipedia, it's a closed loop. It goes around, it comes around, it goes out, it comes around. So I don't think it's going to have any major effect on ocean level rise. Have I missed something, Dr. Helen?
I don't think so, because you're right. The water isn't extra. It's either in ice sheets or it's just thermal expansion. So actually, half of the sea level rise is due to just warmer water taking up more space. So it's not extra water in that sense. It's just water that's a bit more space hungry. So desalination is interesting, I think, because I have heard there was a bit of a Twitter discussion. I think I saw this question pop up on Twitter, and there were a few comments after it about where do you put all the extra salt? And there's so much salt in the ocean. There is so much salt in the ocean. It takes, I have to, I have tanks in my lab that I have to make as salty as the ocean sometimes. And if you take a bath, standard sort of bath, it takes a bucket of salt to make a bath as salty as the ocean. There is a lot of salt in the ocean. And this is one of the reasons that desalination is really energy expensive. It's a great way to get water. It really is a drop in the ocean. I mean, humanity has done many things that have affected the ocean, but taking water out of it is not going to hurt the ocean at all in this, with the amount that we can desalinate, because as Karl says, it's all got to go somewhere, so it all ends up back in the ocean ultimately. So desalination, and of course as humans are depleting reservoirs more and more, so a lot of our water comes from groundwater, which means it's inside the land. There are basically water in all the little pockets in the soil and the rock, and we are depleting our groundwater reservoirs almost everywhere in the world, taking it out faster than nature is putting it back. And so desalination is going to become more necessary. And it's also, there are places where that groundwater, so for example, right in California, as the groundwater is taken out, effectively the sea comes in, because it just moves through the rock. The rock's like a sponge, the sediment, and the seawater comes in, and so you start to get salt under the fields where you're growing things, and that's a problem. So desalination sounds like a brilliant idea. The only problem with desalination is that it's really energy expensive. So it happens all the time on ships. When there's big research ships at sea, the sort I've lived on, or cruise ships, they are desalinating water all the time. But it's just that they definitely need water, and it's worth spending that energy because you have to have a water supply. And in fact, on a ship, which is where the ratio of people to space is quite high, they will say to you, please don't anyone have more than one shower a day, because the desalinator can only work so fast. And obviously we definitely need fresh water for drinking and cooking, so don't all have showers all at the same time, because the system can't keep up. So that is a real limitation. So basically the only problem with desalination really, apart from where you put the salt, is the energy it takes up. But I think it's going to become more common. Does it happen in Australia, Karl? Are the big plants there?
Yes, in the city of Perth, which is on the west coast of Australia and one of the most remote cities in the world, they get 40% of their water from desalination. Part of the problem is that the rains are shifting. And so the weather bands with global warming, which, by the way, the climatologist told us was real 30 years ago, and we're still burning fossil fuels. I don't understand that. The weather bands are moving from the equator at 5 kilometres per year. They're moving from the equator towards the pole, 5 kilometres per year, 50 kilometres per decade, 500 kilometres per century. And because of local geological conditions in Perth, they're especially vulnerable. So today, 40% of their water that they drink comes out of desal plants.
So it can be scaled up. I bet it's not cheap though. Although, do they run off solar power? Or because presumably they could in Perth.
We have a series of governments in Australia that deny climate change. We had a Prime Minister saying that climate change is crap.
Which is not helpful. Okay.
And it's also inaccurate.
Yes. Let's be very clear about that. We do not agree with these Prime Ministers of Australia. Okay, we have a live question that was sent in about a quarter of an hour ago. And it is from Cara. And it is, how would you explain how light can be bounced around, i.e. using a glitter ball? I like your choice of example. So many things bounce light around, but you chose a glitter ball because that is the most fun kind of light bouncing around. Karl, do you want to have a go at this one?
Well, you've got a light source. It can either be a very narrow point source, or it can be even narrower, like a little laser, or they're a bit dangerous, or it can be just a broad source. It ends up on a ball, and the surface of the ball is covered with several, I'm guessing, 100 small flat mirrors, which then, if they were perfectly aligned around the curve, would give you a nice even reflection, but they're not perfectly aligned, so you get random effects and then the ball rotates. Now, I think I've sort of run out of what I can do until you stimulate me with further thinking with your fine brain, Dr. Helen.
Well, I'm just going to very carefully... It's what the thing. So here's the thing about that question, Cara, is that I don't know. So this is a question that's got different answers depending on how much previous knowledge you have, and they're not all, none of them are wrong, but they're all just different ways of looking at the problem. So the simplest method is imagining a snooker ball bouncing off the side of a snooker table. You know, it goes in, it bounces off at the same angle that it came in at, just on the other side. And then you get much further down into electromagnetism and what it really is, and why is it that if you send this wave of an electric field and a magnetic field, why does it bounce off? What does that mean? And that gets into how electric and magnetic fields, what they do when they meet a different substance, and how they deal with a boundary where things don't match, because the wave does go in a little way, but not in a way that it can carry on. And the way the energy works is the only solution to there's an answer to this question, which is that in some really beautiful maths, the only way the maths works, that all the jigsaw pieces fit together, is that there is a reflected wave. And that's not a satisfying solution, but there is a very beautiful bit of physics at the bottom of it, which basically is that. So it's a really interesting question because it depends on where you're asking about. I remember a few years ago, I was cycling in London here, where we have black taxis, behind a black taxi, and I realised I was waiting at traffic lights, and I realised I was looking at my reflection in a black taxi. And I thought I need to think about that, because obviously if it's black, all the light is supposed to be absorbed by it and not reflected. But I am looking at my reflection in the surface of the taxi, right? This is odd. And the answer to that particular one, of course, is that some light is always reflected off. And actually, so normally you can't see it. If the light that goes into the material a little way, so some of it's absorbed and then comes back, that can overwhelm all the light that's directly reflected, but some always bounces directly off the front, and it depends a bit on which angle you're looking at for. So you would think that a black surface has to be perfectly absorbing, but you can have a shiny black surface which both reflects and absorbs all colours equally when it absorbs them. So there's all these interesting little things. Okay, we're nearly running out of time. We have one more question here. Because we have saved the hard one for last, I think. And it is from Katya S. And she's put question for me, but I reckon Karl might have something to say about this as well. And it's in one of the recent Ince episodes. Trent will get me to wave the flag for the series again. You all know it's online. One of the scientists was talking about how for a very long time we've been looking for a general theory of granular materials. What would that entail? So, Karl, do you perhaps want to start us off on what granular materials are?
Well, let me start with coffee and the big coffee problem and talk about one specific thing and then hand over to you. Thank you very much, Helen. So when you grind coffee, surprisingly, you end up with granular material ranging 100 to 1. So you can have grains as small as 10 microns up to 1,000 microns. So you've got 10 times from 10 to 100, and then from 100 up to 1,000, that's another 10. That's 100 to 1, and that leads to what's called clumping. And just recently, a bunch of computational chemists, physicists, computer engineers, and of course baristas were able to solve the problem of clumping, which all professional baristas know about. When they go to their international competitions, they have to make 4 cups of coffee, all identical, and they're using the same material, and they've done it a lot of times, and they're very skilled, and they can each come out tasting differently. What you would think is that you have your little basket of coffee and you push through the water or steam at high pressure, and evenly and democratically the water/steam comes through and extracts the same amount of goodness from each coffee grain, which then goes into the little bit at the bottom and then into your espresso cup. However, because there's such a huge range of sizes with the granular materials, you can have the little ones wedging in between the big ones, and they form a clump. And so if this is your coffee here, over here is a clump, and water does not penetrate it. But there's a channel around the outside, and there's some 2,000 plus chemicals in the coffee. And so a lot of chemicals are extracted from the channel and virtually nothing from in between, which is why you can have such a terribly broad inconsistency with making coffee. Over to you, Dr. Helen.
Well, it is clearly, I'm not a coffee drinker. I do quite like the smell of coffee, but I don't drink it.
What?
Never really got. It's funny. I don't really like the taste of coffee, but I do like the smell. When there have been times when I've bought it for friends, nice ground coffee, and I've just sort of kept it around for a bit because I like the smell, but I don't drink it. Never got the taste for it when I was a kid. So the coffee snobs are obviously all very exercised by this question for good reason. But going back to Katya's question, it's a really, granular materials are frustrating because they are so, you would think, so a granular material is just lots of bits piled up one on top of the other. And you would think that we know what those do. And the problem is we don't, because sometimes they behave like a solid. You can stand on top of a pile of soil or coffee or beans or something, and you can definitely stand on top of it. It's behaving like a solid, but you can also pour it out of a jug so it can behave like a liquid. And if you put it in zero gravity, for example, where we were on the parabolic flight, it just kind of floats around in its space and it behaves like a gas. So they're really, and the granular material in here. So this is a granular material in my little egg timer here, and you can see that it's almost flowing like it's water. But then you add the magnetism and it makes all these little tree shapes. So Katya asked, what would it mean, a general theory of granular materials? And what it means is we make them behave. Physicists like it when things behave. So, for example, if we have a balloon with some gas in it, we know if we squeeze it this much, the pressure has to go up by a fixed amount. There's a mathematical relationship that says this much squeeze makes the pressure do this. And it's the same with liquids and solids. There's equations of state, which means that if you change the pressure, you get a fixed alteration to volume and in density, and all these things are interlinked. It depends on the temperature. And we can write down equations for solids and liquids and gases. We can write down equations that say this much squeeze, if we do this to it, it will do this. And the problem is with granular materials, like Karl was saying, you can put exactly the same granular material into two situations that look identical, but because the tiny details are different, it does completely different things. So what physicists are looking for is basically a single theory that deals with all of that complication, because physicists like things to be tidy. And sadly, in this case, I think if a theory does come along, it's going to be a very complicated theory, because if it was anything simple, frankly, someone would already have noticed. You can see the simplest thing. So one of the first things I came into contact with granular materials is something called the Angle of Repose. And you see this, you know it, that if you take your materials and you pile them up, you can see, oh, they're not quite piled up enough yet. But you know that once they start making a pile, it has a fixed angle. So you can see this one's quite a shallow little hill that it's making all by itself. Now, that angle is really specific to the material. If you do it with beans, if you do it with Lego bricks, if you do it with soil, if you do it with clay, they all have a different angle. And just predicting that angle, say we give you one Lego brick and say, if I had 10 million of these and I poured them out in a big pile, what would the angle be? And a physicist cannot tell you the answer.
Really?
And it's that sort of and that's such a simple thing. And so that's why that's the sort of thing that what physicists want is for granular materials to be tidied up nicely. But as anyone who has ever worked with glitter on a craft project knows, granular materials are not into being nice and tidy. Okay, we have reached the end of our allotted questions and answers. We've almost got to the end of all the questions as well. So I think we have done very well. So just before we finish, we'll be back next Sunday. Robin will be back hopefully as well, 3 p.m. with even more of your questions. So keep thinking of all those odd questions. Send them all in. You can support us on Patreon. You can put things in the tip jar. There's lots of things on the screen above or below or around the screen you're looking at us on. So do contribute to that. We have Genetic Shambles on Wednesday at 8:30. We have Teenage Student Neuro Hurdles. I am never going to be able to say that quickly. At 7:30 on Tuesday. Dr. Karl has written 1 million books, apparently, or lots of them. It's a large number. He can probably, what did you say it was, Karl? 46? 45?
I'm doing one in my 46th book has got a story about an animal that instead of having an anus there 24 hours a day, generates an anus only when it wishes to defecate, and then it gets rid of it until the next time. And also a story about how black holes have no size. People get upset by that, and how a dead fish can swim.
So if you have ever wanted to know, if you've ever felt frustrated with your anus and wished you couldn't get rid of it, Dr. Karl has the answer for you in his book. So on that note, because we're all about sensible science here at Cosmic Shambles, we will finish for today. So I hope you have enjoyed the rest of your afternoon, and we will see you next week.